Growing up, the difference between my brother Steve and me was only a couple of years. But those 2 years meant everything in how we were treated by our parents and, eventually, the world around us. I was the older one, and with that title came responsibilities, expectations, and, if I'm being honest, a fair bit of resentment. Steve, on the other hand, was the golden child, the audience favorite, as I liked to call him. Maybe it was because he was the younger one, or maybe it was his charm, but everything just seemed to come easier for Steve. It was like there was an invisible force ensuring he always got the better deal. When we were kids, it started with small things. I got a regular mountain bike, and Steve? He got a top-of-the-line one with gears and fancy bells. When we hit our teenage years, I was given an old, beat-up moped, one that rattled and smelled of gasoline. But Steve, he was gifted a brand-new Viper scooter that could zip through the streets like a dream. It didn't stop there. As adults, it only got worse. When I finally scraped together enough money for a used car, a relic from our grandfather, Steve was handed the keys to a new Audi as a graduation gift. It was like a running joke at this point. Every time I worked hard to achieve something, Steve would breeze in and get something twice as good handed to him on a silver platter. Yet, despite all the jealousy, despite all the differences, he was still my brother. The person I had shared bunk beds with, fought over the TV remote with, and confided in during late-night talks when our parents were asleep. I loved him, even when I hated him. As we grew older, I built a life of my own. I got married to the love of my life, Rachel. She was everything I could ever want, smart, funny, and fiercely supportive. We were about to have our first child, a boy, and I was over the moon. I had never been more excited or proud in my life. All the tension, all the years of competition with Steve, faded away as I thought about the family I was about to build. We even decided to host a family gathering to celebrate Rachel's pregnancy. It was a beautiful evening, full of laughter and warmth. Everyone was there. My parents, Rachel's family, and of course, Steve, who had, unsurprisingly, made quite an entrance with his brand-new sports car. Still, I wasn't going to let that bother me. Not tonight. Tonight was about celebrating our future, our son, and the joy of family. But Steve? Steve wanted more beer. It was late into the evening, and the air was filled with the low hum of conversation and the occasional clinking of glasses. Everyone was relaxed, happy, and just a little bit tipsy. Steve, though, was more than tipsy, he was downright drunk. He had always been able to drink more than me, and tonight was no exception. "Hey, we're out of beer," Steve announced, standing up and swaying slightly. "I'll make a quick run to the store." I immediately stepped in. "You're not driving like this, Steve. You're drunk." Steve, being Steve, rolled his eyes, jumped to his feet, and waved me off. "I'm fine, man. I've driven after drinking loads of times. I know what I'm doing." "Steve, no," I said firmly. "I'm not letting you do this." But Steve, being the charming, persuasive brother he always was, didn't take no for an answer. He paced around, throwing out all sorts of excuses. The more he spoke, the more frustrated I became. In the end, I realized the only way to prevent him from doing something stupid was to go with him, make sure he didn't do anything reckless. "Fine," I said, grabbing my jacket. "I'll go with you. But you're driving slow. Understand?" Steve flashed that same smirk he had when we were kids, always getting his way. "Sure, sure. Whatever you say, big brother." As we got into the car, the night was peaceful, with the roads mostly empty and the air cool. For a few minutes, I thought maybe things would be fine. Steve was still talking, rambling about something I wasn't even paying attention to. I was more focused on watching the road, ensuring he didn't pull any of his usual stunts. But it didn't take long before his overconfidence got the better of him. He started speeding up, the hum of the engine growing louder with each passing second. "Steve, slow down," I said, my voice firm. "We don't need to get pulled over." "Relax," he chuckled, gripping the wheel. "I've got this." But he didn't. We were coming up on a corner, and the car skidded slightly as we turned. I felt my stomach drop. Before I could say anything, we swerved into the opposite lane, heading straight toward an oncoming car. Time slowed. The headlights blinded me, the screech of brakes filled the air, and then the impact. The crunch of metal and glass was deafening. The car spun, my body thrown against the door, my heart pounding in my ears. When we finally stopped, my head was spinning. I blinked through the haze, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Steve was still in the driver's seat, alive but dazed. I turned to the other car, a crumpled heap of metal. And then I saw him. The man in the other car, slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the scene, casting a harsh glow over the twisted wreckage. The paramedics arrived first, pulling the man from the other car and rushing him to the hospital. But even as they worked, I had a sinking feeling in my gut. This wasn't just an accident. This was something much worse. The cops arrived shortly after. I was still in shock, my mind reeling from the crash. I was sitting on the curb, head in my hands, trying to process what had just happened. Steve, however, had a different reaction. He walked over to the officers with an air of confidence. His swagger barely diminished despite the accident. "Officer," he began, his voice steady, "my brother was driving." I froze. It felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. I looked up at him, disbelief written all over my face. "What are you doing?" I whispered. Steve ignored me. He was talking fast, spinning a story. He told the cops that I had been behind the wheel, that I had lost control of the car. He said the visibility was bad and that it wasn't entirely my fault. I would probably get a fine or, at worst, probation. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own brother, the person I had tried to protect, was throwing me under the bus. He was lying to save himself. As he turned to me, his eyes were cold and calculating. "It's just a little fine," he muttered under his breath. "If they find out I was driving, I'll lose my license. Maybe go to jail. But you'll be fine." I stared at him, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. I was angry, but more than that, I was hurt. How could he do this to me? After everything we had been through, after all the times I had defended him, helped him, protected him, this was how he repaid me? The officers pulled me aside, questioning me. I didn't know what to say. I was in shock, and Steve's words echoed in my mind. If I admitted the truth, he would go to jail. I couldn't do that to him. He was my brother. So, against my better judgment, I stayed silent. I let them believe his lie. As the days passed, the reality of what had happened hit me like a ton of brick. The man from the other car hadn't made it. His heart had stopped on the way to the hospital, and now, it wasn't just a case of reckless driving. It was manslaughter. The case moved quickly. Steve's plan to pin the blame on me had worked. I was charged with causing the accident, and because of the man's death, the charges were serious. My lawyer tried to argue for leniency, but the evidence was stacked against me. The crash had killed a man, and someone had to pay the price. I was sentenced to 5 years in prison. As the gavel fell, I glanced over at Steve. He wasn't even in the courtroom. He had moved on with his life, free, while I was about to lose everything. I would never see the birth of my son, never be there for his first steps, his first words, or his first day of school. Rachel, who had stood by me through everything, was devastated. And me? I was going to prison for a crime I didn't commit. Prison was bleak. There's no other way to describe it. Every day felt like an eternity, and the weight of Steve's betrayal sat on my shoulders like a crushing boulder. I was in a constant state of disbelief. How had my life come to this? How had I allowed myself to be fooled, to be sacrificed for someone who clearly didn't value me? The worst part wasn't the prison itself, it was knowing what I had missed. Rachel sent me letters, pictures of our son, stories of his first words, his first birthday, his first everything. Every time I opened one of those letters, my heart shattered a little more. I wasn't there. I was supposed to be there. Steve? He was living his life. I'd hear bits and pieces from my family. He had gotten a promotion at work. He had a new girlfriend. He was traveling. While I sat behind bars, he was living the life I should have had. But then, something changed. About 3 years into my sentence, I received a letter. It was from Steve. At first, I didn't want to open it. I had spent years trying to forget about him, trying to move on from the betrayal. But curiosity got the better of me, and I tore the envelope open. The letter was unexpected. "John," it began, "I've been living with the guilt of what I did to you every day. I thought I could move on, but I can't. I see that man's face in my dreams. I see you in that cell, and I know that it should be me. I don't know how to make this right, but I can't live with myself anymore." It went on, detailing how his life had spiraled despite his outward success. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't focus. His relationships were falling apart, and he felt like he was suffocating under the weight of his own guilt. He ended the letter with a confession. He was ready to turn himself in. Steve's confession didn't come easily. I didn't respond to his letter right away. In fact, I threw it into the corner of my cell, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to forgive him, to tell him that everything was okay, that we could fix this together. But another part of me, the part that had spent years behind bars, was angry that it had taken him this long to realize the weight of his actions. A few weeks later, Steve showed up at the prison. I wasn't expecting him, and seeing his face brought a flood of emotions I wasn't ready to deal with. He looked older, tired. The once charming and confident brother I had known was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. "I'm going to the police," he said the moment he saw me. "I'm going to tell them the truth." I stared at him, not knowing what to say. For so long I had dreamed of this moment, but now that it was here, it felt hollow. "Why now?" I asked quietly. Steve looked down, ashamed. "Because I can't live with myself anymore. You didn't deserve this. I should have come clean a long time ago. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to." He knew what he had done. True to his word, Steve went to the police and confessed everything. The investigation was reopened, and after a long, grueling process, my conviction was overturned. I was a free man, but it didn't feel like a victory. When I finally walked out of those prison gates, Rachel was there, waiting for me. She held our son's hand, our boy, now 5 years old, about to start school. I had missed so much, and the weight of those lost years hit me like a ton of bricks. But as I hugged my wife and my son, I realized that I still had time. Time to rebuild, time to be the father I wanted to be. Steve? He went to prison, just as I had. He served his time for the crime he committed, and when he got out, we never really spoke again. I couldn't bring myself to forgive him, not fully. But I had moved on. I had a life to live, a family to cherish, and I wasn't going to waste another moment. Because in the end, family is supposed to be everything. But sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who hurt us the most. It's what you do with that hurt that defines who you are. And I chose to live. Even after the confession, after the court overturned my conviction and set me free, it didn't feel like justice. Not really. 5 years, 5 lost years, felt like an eternity when I looked at my son, Luke. He had started school now, and Rachel had done a phenomenal job raising him. She had sent me letters, photos, and updates throughout my prison sentence, but nothing prepared me for the reality of seeing how much he had grown, how much of his life I had missed. The moment I walked out of the prison gates and saw him standing there with Rachel, I felt a sharp ache. He was taller than I remembered. His face had lost the babyish roundness and was now more angular, with a serious expression. He had Rachel's eyes, deep, thoughtful, and a little sad. As if, even at his young age, he understood the gravity of the situation. "Dad." His voice trembled when he said it, unsure of what to expect from me. I knelt down, tears pricking my eyes as I pulled him into a tight embrace. "Hey, buddy. I missed you so much." He didn't say anything, just buried his head in my shoulder. I had missed his first steps, his first words, and countless birthdays. There was a long road ahead, one I wasn't sure I could navigate easily, but at least I had my family. And then there was Steve. The day he went to the police, he set off a chain of events that brought everything into sharp relief. He had confessed, admitted to driving drunk that night, and taken responsibility for the man's death. The process of overturning my conviction was slow, grueling, and filled with mixed emotions. While I appreciated his courage to finally come forward, it didn't erase the pain and anger I carried inside. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison. The court acknowledged that his late confession, while appreciated, didn't absolve him of the severity of the crime. The judge spoke about the importance of accountability and how his actions that night, and the lies that followed, had destroyed lives, including mine. And yet, when the gavel fell, I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I would. The day I went to visit Steve in prison was cold and gray, fitting for the emotions swirling in me. I wasn't sure what I was expecting from this visit. Closure? Maybe. Or perhaps I just wanted to understand why he chose to betray me, why it took him so long to come clean. When I arrived at the visitors' area, Steve was already sitting at a metal table, his hands folded in front of him. He looked different, thinner, older, his cocky swagger replaced by a somberness I had never seen in him before. He looked up as I sat down across from him, his eyes filled with a mix of shame and regret. "John," he started, his voice hoarse, I don't even know where to begin. Why? The word escaped my lips before I could stop it. I didn't have the energy for small talk or pleasantries. I just wanted the truth. Why did you do it? Why lie? Steve exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. I don't know, man. I was scared. I wasn't thinking straight. I knew if I got caught, I'd lose everything. My license, my job. Everything I had worked for. And you've always been the responsible one. I thought you could handle it. I clenched my fists under the table, anger bubbling beneath the surface. Handle it? I went to prison, Steve. I missed the birth of my son. I missed 5 years of my life, 5 years of his life. And you're telling me you thought I could handle it? I know, Steve whispered, his voice breaking. I know I messed up. I've lived with that every day since. But I didn't know how to fix it. The longer I waited, the harder it became. I'm sorry, John. I know sorry doesn't cut it, but I'm saying it anyway. We sat in silence for a long time after that, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. I wanted to yell, to scream, to make him feel the same pain I had carried for so long. But looking at him now, broken, remorseful, I realized that he already did. The real question was, could I forgive him? Life after Steve's confession wasn't magically easier. Sure, I was free, but the 5 years in prison had changed me. I had seen things, experienced things that left their mark. There were nightmares, flashes of the accident, the man who had died, and the sound of the gavel sentencing me for a crime I didn't commit. Rachel tried to be patient with me, but there were nights I woke up in a cold sweat, unable to shake the memories. Then there was Luke. My son was still getting used to having me around, and I didn't blame him. To him, I was a stranger, a man he had only known through stories and pictures. It took time, weeks of small, careful conversations, of playing catch in the backyard, of reading him bedtime stories. Slowly but surely, I began to rebuild the bond we should have had from the start. The first time he called me Dad, without hesitation, my heart nearly burst with happiness. As for Rachel, she had been a rock through everything. She had raised Luke, kept our home together, and fought for me when I was too tired to fight for myself. But there were wounds between us, too. The strain of those 5 years had taken a toll, and we had to relearn how to be a couple again. It wasn't easy, but we worked at it, piece by piece, until we found each other again. One Saturday afternoon, about 2 years after my release, there was a knock at the door. I was in the kitchen, making lunch for Luke and Rachel, when I heard it. When I opened the door, my heart skipped a beat. It was Steve. He was out on parole, his time in prison cut short for good behavior. He looked rough, his face lined with guilt and the wear of the years spent behind bars. For a long moment, Neither of us said anything. We just stood there, two brothers with a lifetime of history between us, both good and bad. I didn't know where else to go, Steve finally said, his voice low. Part of me wanted to slam the door in his face. Part of me wanted to tell him that he didn't deserve to be here, that after everything, he wasn't welcome in my life anymore. But then I thought about the past 2 years, about how hard it had been to move on, about how forgiveness had been more for me than for him. I stepped aside, allowing him to come in. We sat at the kitchen table, Steve looking awkward and out of place. Rachel and Luke were out back, playing in the yard, their laughter drifting in through the open window. "How are you?" I asked, the question simple but loaded. Steve shrugged. "I'm trying. It's not easy. Prison changed me. But I'm doing what I can." There was a long pause before he spoke again. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," Steve said, his eyes meeting mine. "And I don't expect it. But I want you to know that I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make things right. I want to be a better person, a better brother. I don't know if that means anything to you now, but it's all I've got." For the first time in years, I felt something other than anger when I looked at Steve. It wasn't full forgiveness, not yet. But it was a start. He had taken responsibility, and he was trying to change. That was more than I had ever expected from him. "You've got a long way to go, Steve," I said quietly. "But maybe someday we can get there." Steve nodded, a small flicker of hope in his eyes. Life wasn't perfect, but it was moving forward. Luke was growing up, and every day I was more amazed at the person he was becoming. Rachel and I had rebuilt our relationship, stronger than ever. And Steve, well, Steve was still figuring things out. He got a job at a local mechanic shop, fixing up old cars and staying out of trouble. He wasn't the same carefree, reckless guy he had been before. He had changed, and while it would take time for me to fully trust him again, we were making progress. One day, as I watched Luke playing in the backyard, laughing and carefree, I realized something important. I had spent so many years holding on to the pain, the anger, the bitterness. But now I was letting it go. I was living in the present, not in the shadow of what had happened. The accident, the prison sentence, the betrayal, it had all shaped me, but it didn't define me. I had my family, my freedom, and a future that was mine to create. And that, more than anything, was enough.